The rancher sought a cook. The Apache woman said, "I came to be your wife." Everything changed. The sun was just beginning to rise over the wide, dusty plains of the southwest, casting long golden rays across the rolling hills and the sparse clusters of trees. The rancher, a man in his early 40s named Thomas, stood outside his small wooden house, rubbing his eyes and surveying the land. It had been a long summer, and the drought had left the soil cracked and the grass brittle. His ranch, which had once thrived with cattle and horses, now struggled to survive. He sighed, his worn hands tightening on the railing. Managing the ranch alone was exhausting, and Thomas knew that he needed help. More than just a hand with the cattle. He needed someone who could keep his house in order, cook his meals, and bring a sense of warmth to the quiet, lonely house he had lived in since his wife passed several years ago. He had posted an advertisement in the town looking for a cook. A practical person, he did not expect anyone extraordinary, just someone who could manage the kitchen, clean the house, and help him keep his life organized. He had received a few responses from women in town, but none had seemed promising. Most were inexperienced or unwilling to endure the isolation of life on the ranch. He had almost given up hope when he received word that a woman had arrived who wanted the position. The day she arrived, Thomas was outside repairing the fence when he first saw her. She rode a horse that seemed small but strong, and she wore simple clothing that marked her as different from the women he had met in town. Her skin was a warm copper tone, her hair dark and long, tied neatly behind her head, and her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and calm. There was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself that made Thomas stop in his tracks. He had expected a timid woman, someone who would be shy or nervous. But this woman had a presence that made him uneasy in the best way. She dismounted with ease, her movements smooth and controlled, and approached him. "Good morning," she said softly, but her voice had strength. "I am here about the job." Thomas straightened, trying to regain his composure.
"Ah, yes," he said, clearing his throat.
I'm Thomas. Welcome to the ranch. I'm looking for a cook. Are you here to fill that position?" The woman smiled faintly, and Thomas felt a flicker of unease, mixed with curiosity. Then she said something that made him blink in surprise. "I came to be your wife." Thomas stared at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, fumbling for something to say. He had not expected such a statement, certainly not from someone he had just met. I'm sorry," he finally managed. "I said, I came to be your wife," she repeated, her voice calm, as if she had simply stated a fact about the weather. There was no jest, no hint of a joke. Thomas felt a mix of shock, confusion, and a strange curiosity. "Your wife?" he asked slowly, trying to process the words. I wasn't expecting that." "I was only looking for a cook." "Yes, I can cook. I can clean. I can manage a home. But I did not come only for work. I came for something more." Thomas ran a hand over his face. He had spent many nights alone in this house, thinking about what he had lost and what he still wanted. He had tried to fill the emptiness with work, with caring for his land and animals, but it had never been enough. The thought of a companion, a partner, was not unfamiliar, but the reality of someone arriving and offering herself in this way was beyond anything he could have imagined. "Why me?" he asked finally, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Why here? Why now?" The woman looked at him steadily. "Because I see a life that can be shared. I see a man who works hard, who cares for this land, who is good and honest. I can help you, and together we can have more than survival. We can have a home, a family, a life." Thomas felt his chest tighten. There was something in her words, a sincerity that he could not deny. She did not speak with arrogance or demand. She spoke with conviction and calm certainty. There was a strength in her, an inner resolve, that made him feel both cautious and intrigued. He wanted to ask more, to understand her intentions fully, but he also felt the pull of something unexpected, a hope he had long thought lost.
Over the next few hours, they walked through the ranch together.
She examined the house, the kitchen, and the storeroom with a keen eye, noting what needed repair, what supplies were missing, and how the space could be better organized. He spoke with respect and intelligence, suggesting practical solutions and showing a knowledge of food, preservation, and household management that impressed Thomas deeply. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas realized that despite the shock of her words, he was beginning to admire her. She was capable, observant, and unafraid. She did not wait for permission. She simply acted where action was needed. It was clear that she could manage not only the kitchen but also the rhythm of life on the ranch. When they returned to the porch of the house, Thomas offered her a glass of water, and they sat in silence for a few moments. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and earth, and the quiet of the plains seemed to stretch endlessly. Thomas thought about the loneliness that had filled his house, the long nights when he had felt the emptiness most keenly, and he realized that her presence was already changing something inside him. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, finally. I've never had someone come to me like this. It's unusual." She smiled gently. "I know. It is unusual. But sometimes life gives us what we need in ways we do not expect. I did not come to impose myself on you. I came to offer something that can make both of our lives better." Thomas nodded slowly. There was a calmness in her demeanor that contrasted with the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. He did not fully understand what was happening, but he felt a strange sense of rightness. Perhaps this was the beginning of a change he had longed for, a shift in the quiet rhythm of his days. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, she began to unpack her belongings, simple items, neatly arranged, each chosen with care. Thomas watched as she moved with efficiency and grace, preparing the kitchen for the evening meal. The smell of fresh bread baking in the oven soon filled the house, and Thomas realized he had not felt hunger in weeks. When they sat down to eat, Thomas noticed how natural she seemed, how easily she fit into the rhythm of the house. She spoke quietly but with warmth, asking about the ranch, his work, and the animals. She listened attentively when he spoke, nodding and responding with thoughtful observations. For the first time in many years, Thomas felt a sense of companionship, a quiet comfort that he had almost forgotten existed. As night fell, the wind carrying the distant cries of coyotes across the plains, Thomas reflected on the day. The arrival of this woman, so confident and capable, had turned his expectations upside down. He had sought a cook, someone to manage the kitchen, and instead he had encountered a presence that challenged him, intrigued him, and perhaps in time would change him completely. For now, they sat in the quiet of the house, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, both aware of the unspoken possibilities that lay ahead. Thomas did not know what the future would hold, but he understood that life on the ranch and in his heart was about to be very different. And somehow he felt that for the first time in a long time, that difference was something he could welcome. The night grew deeper and the stars appeared over the vast plains. The Apache woman prepared for bed with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her day, and Thomas found himself feeling a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and cautious hope. The ranch, once a place of struggle and loneliness, now seemed filled with potential, and he understood that the journey he had thought would be simple, finding a cook, might instead lead to something far more extraordinary, a companion, a partner, and perhaps in time a family. And as he lay in bed that night, Thomas realized that the first day of this unexpected chapter had only just begun. The morning sun broke over the ranch, spilling light across the dry plains and warming the wooden house where Thomas and the Apache woman had spent their first night together. Birds began their quiet songs, and the faint rustle of the wind through the grass marked the start of another long day. Thomas rose early, as he always did, stepping outside to check the livestock. His mind, however, was not on the cattle or the fences, but on the woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life. She was already in the kitchen when he returned, moving with a quiet confidence that made even the simplest tasks seem graceful. Bread was baking in the oven, and the smell of herbs and cooked vegetables filled the air. Thomas watched for a moment, leaning on the doorway, as she worked without fuss or hesitation. She noticed him but said nothing, simply placing a fresh cloth over the table once the bread was ready. "Good morning," she said softly, looking up with a smile. "Good morning," he replied, feeling a strange warmth at the simplicity of her voice. "The smell of bread. It's wonderful." She nodded. It's an early start, but it helps to prepare for the day. The work will be long, and you must have energy. Thomas felt a twinge of embarrassment at how unaccustomed he was to someone caring in such a practical, thoughtful way. For years he had managed alone, and now this quiet presence in his house seemed to offer both help and companionship in a way he could not yet name. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Thomas noticed that she had prepared simple dishes, yet each one seemed full of flavor and care. She moved gracefully from the stove to the table, setting the food down with a natural confidence. As he ate, he found himself watching her more than the food, trying to understand this woman who had declared she came to be his wife. After breakfast, they walked through the ranch together. He wanted to see everything, to understand the land and the animals as he did. Thomas showed her the corrals, the small barn, and the fields that were struggling under the heat of the sun. She asked questions, curious but respectful. Her questions were not just polite, they revealed intelligence and a genuine desire to learn. "Do the cows need water every day?" she asked as they stopped by the trough.
Yes, Thomas replied, slightly surprised by her interest.
"The well can only hold so much. I have to manage carefully, especially with the heat." "I see. Then we can make sure they have the best water each day." "And the horses?" He was impressed. Most people who came to the ranch would have overlooked the animals or dismissed them as work. But she seemed to understand their importance, not just as laborers or property, but as living beings that required care. There was a respect in her voice, and Thomas felt a growing admiration. Over the next few days, life settled into a rhythm. She cooked, cleaned, and managed the house with skill. She also began to show subtle ways of teaching Thomas to make life easier, how to preserve food for longer, how to organize tools, and even small tips for handling the ranch hands more effectively. Thomas found himself learning, and for the first time he did not resent the lessons. Instead, he felt grateful. Despite their growing comfort, there were moments of tension. Thomas was a man set in his ways, accustomed to solitude and independence. The idea of someone being so involved in his life, someone who had so boldly declared herself his wife, was still strange. He would occasionally bristle at suggestions, or resist changes to routines he had followed for years. She never argued. Instead, she continued quietly, letting her actions speak. She respected his space, but also made sure that he noticed the improvements her presence brought. Slowly, Thomas began to understand her approach. She did not demand or force. She guided, assisted, and encouraged. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Thomas found himself sitting on the porch while she swept the kitchen floor. The light caught her hair, and he noticed small details he had not before. The way she moved, careful and deliberate, yet confident and unhurried. He realized that in all his years he had never truly seen someone act with such quiet strength. "You work very hard," he said, almost without thinking. She paused, smiling faintly.
"And you work hard too. That is why the ranch survives."
"But life is not only work. We must care for each other as well." Her words lingered in his mind. For years, he had been consumed by labor, by the constant struggle to keep the ranch alive. He had forgotten about care for himself, for others, for the small moments that made life meaningful. She seemed to understand something he had overlooked, and he felt a quiet respect growing alongside curiosity. Over the next weeks, their bond deepened. She began to share small parts of her life with him, stories of her family, the lessons she had learned growing up among her people, and the skills passed down to her in the kitchen and in caring for the home. Thomas listened, sometimes silently, sometimes asking questions, always learning. He had not realized how much he missed conversation, stories, and understanding beyond the work of ranching. One day a neighbor visited, curious about the new woman on the ranch. Thomas had expected skepticism, maybe even disapproval, but the neighbor was taken aback by her confidence and intelligence. She greeted him politely, answered his questions with knowledge, and even offered practical advice on the soil and crops. By the time he left, Thomas felt a quiet pride. This woman, who had arrived with a startling declaration, was already making the ranch stronger and more respected. But life was not without challenges. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds filling the sky and wind whipping across the plains. Thomas rushed to secure the animals, fearing for their safety, and found her helping without hesitation. She guided the hands, tied down supplies, and ensured the smaller animals were safe. Her calmness in the face of chaos impressed him deeply. When the storm passed, leaving the fields muddy and the air thick with the smell of rain, Thomas realized something important. He had been struggling alone for years, believing he could handle everything. But with her presence and skill, the burden felt lighter. He did not need to carry everything alone anymore, and the idea of partnership no longer seemed impossible. Evenings became their quiet time. After the work was done, they would sit on the porch, talking about the day, the land, and sometimes just sitting in silence, listening to the sounds of the plains. Thomas found himself opening up, sharing thoughts and feelings he had kept buried. She listened, always patient, never judgmental, and slowly he began to trust her not only with the ranch, but with his heart. One night he found himself asking a question he had been hesitant to voice. Do you really mean it, that you came to be my wife?" She looked at him steadily, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Yes, I came because I saw a life that could be shared."
I came because I believed we could be stronger together. You need not answer today or tomorrow."
"But know that my offer is sincere." Thomas nodded, feeling a mixture of awe and confusion. Her honesty, her courage, and her calm confidence were unlike anything he had experienced. He realized that the connection he felt was growing stronger, deeper, and more meaningful than simple friendship or respect. Something had begun, quietly, but it was undeniable. Weeks turned into months, and life on the ranch changed in subtle but profound ways. The kitchen was well managed, the animals were cared for, and the house felt alive with warmth. Thomas noticed himself smiling more, working with less strain, and looking forward to the small joys of each day. The Apache woman's presence was no longer just surprising, it was essential. And yet, despite the comfort, there was still mystery. He did not know all of her thoughts, her hopes, or her past. She did not reveal everything at once, but he learned to accept the unknown as part of the gift she brought. Trust, he realized, was not forced, it was earned, and she had earned his in ways that words alone could not capture. As the first snow of winter lightly dusted the plains, Thomas reflected on how much life had changed since that first morning, when she had arrived, announcing she was here to be his wife. What had begun as a practical arrangement, a cook for the ranch, had grown into a quiet partnership built on respect, understanding, and the promise of something more. The rancher no longer felt entirely alone. For the first time in years, he felt hope, not just for the survival of his ranch, but for life itself. And he knew, deep in his heart, that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with her by his side. The ranch had grown quieter as the summer stretched into late August. The days were hot and dry, and the earth was cracking under the sun's unrelenting glare. Thomas rose early, as usual, and stepped outside to check the livestock. The cattle seemed weaker than before, their backs bent under the heat, and the grass had all but disappeared in the pastures. It was a difficult season, and Thomas knew that managing the ranch alone, or even with help, would be a true test of endurance. The Apache woman, whose name was Island, had quickly become indispensable. She had not only managed the household, but had begun learning about the land, the animals, and even the practical routines of ranch life. Today she joined Thomas in walking the pastures, water bucket in hand, checking each trough and making careful notes. "The water in this trough is low," Aylan said quietly, examining the well. "If we do not find another source soon, the cattle will suffer." "I know. The well is drying faster than I thought. I have been rationing the water, but it may not be enough if this heat continues."
Aylan studied the fields thoughtfully.
"We can dig another shallow well here," she said, pointing to a low area near the creek bed. "It will not be perfect, but it will help. And we can move some of the animals closer to shade during the hottest hours." Thomas felt a mix of admiration and surprise. He had expected someone who could cook and clean, but Aylin was already thinking strategically, helping to protect the ranch from disaster. He realized again how fortunate he was to have her presence, not just as a helper, but as a partner in every sense. Despite their growing partnership, life on the ranch was far from easy. The drought made everything harder. Crops withered in the fields, livestock lost weight, and every day was a careful balance between what could be done and what had to be left undone. Even the ranch hands began to grumble, blaming the heat, the lack of water, and the increasing difficulty of the work. Some of them, Thomas noticed, whispered when Aylin was nearby. They questioned her presence, saying that a woman should not have authority on the ranch. Thomas, however, had come to respect her abilities and judgment. Whenever he overheard these comments, he quietly reminded the ranch hands to respect her. He would not tolerate anyone speaking ill of her in front of him. One afternoon, the situation came to a head. A young ranch hand, frustrated with the hard work and the heat, confronted Thomas while Aylin was nearby.
I don't understand why she's running things, he said, his tone sharp.
She's just a woman. She should be cooking and cleaning, not telling us how to work. Thomas felt his patience thin, but he kept his voice calm. Aylin knows what she's doing. You will follow her instructions just as you follow mine. This is her ranch as much as it is mine, and we work together. If you cannot respect that, you can find another place to work. The young man stared at him, shocked at the firmness in Thomas's voice. He had expected argument or dismissal, but not this quiet authority. Aylin, standing beside Thomas, did not speak. She simply looked at the young man with calm eyes, and in that silence, he understood that she was not to be questioned. He nodded reluctantly and returned to his work. Days passed, and the challenges continued. The cattle became weaker, the drought persisted, and the burden on Thomas grew heavier. Yet Aylin never faltered. She moved with efficiency, ensuring the house ran smoothly, that the animals had water, and that the ranch hands were organized. Even when Thomas felt despair creeping into his thoughts, Aylin's calm presence reminded him that there was always a way forward. One evening, a particularly hot and dusty day, Thomas found himself sitting on the porch, exhausted. Aylin joined him with a pitcher of water and 2 glasses. She handed him one and sat quietly, her eyes observing the land in thoughtful silence. "You are tired," she said softly. "You work too hard. It's not easy. The drought, the cattle, it never ends. Sometimes I wonder if we can keep this ranch alive through it all." Aylin nodded. "The land is difficult, yes, but it is also strong. We must be strong too. If we work together, we can endure more than we think." Her words, simple yet firm, struck Thomas deeply. He realized that her presence was more than help, it was hope. He had been carrying the weight of the ranch alone for so long, but now he had someone who shared that burden. Someone who reminded him that even in hardship, they were not powerless. A week later, a small miracle came in the form of rain. Dark clouds rolled over the plains, and the wind carried the sweet scent of wet earth. The first drops fell gently, then more heavily, soaking the fields and filling the troughs. The cattle, sensing relief, began to move more energetically, and the ranch hands cheered quietly. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the rain, but for Aylin's guidance. Without her, he knew he might not have managed the ranch through the drought. Even as the relief came, challenges continued. The storm brought heavy winds, and some of the fences were damaged. Thomas worked tirelessly to repair them, and Aylin joined him without complaint. Together, they moved the cattle to safer pastures, secured equipment, and ensured the house was protected. In those long hours, their partnership became even clearer. Words were often unnecessary. They understood each other through glances, gestures, and shared effort. As evening fell, they sat together in silence on the porch, watching the sky lighten with the glow of sunset after the storm. Thomas felt a quiet admiration for Aylin, for her resilience, and for the calm way she faced every challenge. She was not just a helper. She was the heart of the ranch, a steady presence that gave him strength he had long thought lost. Their lives were gradually intertwined in ways Thomas had never expected. He began to notice small things: how she arranged the kitchen, how she tended to the animals, how she spoke to the ranch hands with quiet authority. Her presence transformed the ranch, not just in work and order, but in spirit. One night after a particularly exhausting day, Thomas found himself speaking more openly than he had in years. "I don't know how I would manage without you," he admitted, his voice low. "I've been alone for so long and I didn't realize how much it weighed on me."
Alan smiled faintly. You do not need to carry it alone.
"That is why I am here. We share the work, and we share the burden. Together, it becomes lighter." Thomas felt a warmth in his chest that had little to do with the day's heat. He realized that she was not just helping him with the ranch. She was teaching him how to trust, how to rely on someone, and how to accept care as well as give it. As the months passed, the bond between them deepened. The trials of the ranch, the drought, the storms, the difficult labor, and even the skepticism of others became shared experiences. Each challenge they faced together strengthened their connection. Thomas began to see her not just as a helper or a presence in the house, but as a partner, someone whose courage and wisdom complemented his own. Even the small joys of ranch life became richer. Cooking together, repairing fences, walking the pastures, and sitting quietly under the stars. All of these moments were made sweeter because they were shared. Thomas realized that what had begun as a practical arrangement, a cook for the ranch, was transforming into a life of partnership, mutual respect, and quiet love. One morning as the sun rose over the horizon, Thomas stood by the fence with Aylin. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the ranch seemed full of promise. He looked at her and realized something profound. The challenges they had faced had not only tested them, they had shown him her true character, her resilience, and her heart. And he knew that no matter what trials lay ahead, he would not face them alone. Aylin, standing beside him, noticed his gaze and smiled faintly. "The land is strong," she said softly, "and we are strong too." For the first time in years, he felt certain of something. The ranch was not just a place of work and struggle. It was a home, and it had become a home because of her. The trials they faced had not weakened them. They had forged a bond that could endure anything. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling light across the plains, Thomas realized that life on the ranch had changed forever. It was no longer just his burden to bear. With Aylin by his side, he could face each day with hope, determination, and the quiet knowledge that together they could overcome anything. The air carried a sharp chill as winter approached, and the ranch, usually quiet, had begun to take on a harsher edge. The fields were no longer parched, thanks to the earlier rain, but the cold winds and early frost presented new challenges. Thomas and Aylin moved through the ranch together each day, checking fences, feeding the livestock, and preparing the house for the coming cold. Their daily routines, once filled with simple survival, had grown into a rhythm of shared responsibility and quiet companionship. Aylin had taken a more active role in managing the ranch. She suggested improvements to the pens and water systems, organized the supplies, and ensured the ranch hands followed procedures for the animals' safety. Thomas had grown to rely on her guidance, and though he was still stubborn in some ways, he had begun to accept her judgment as both wise and necessary. One afternoon, dark clouds appeared on the horizon, rolling quickly over the plains. Thomas knew immediately that a storm was approaching, one stronger than any they had faced in months. He felt a knot of worry in his chest. The ranch animals, unprotected fields, and fragile structures could all be in danger. He called the ranch hands together and instructed them to begin securing the livestock. Aylin stood calmly beside him, her expression composed but determined. "We can manage this," she said quietly. "We have prepared before, and we will do so again. We must stay organized and act quickly." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude. Her calmness under pressure gave him strength. He realized that no matter how difficult the storm, they could face it together. The wind picked up, and heavy rain began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. The thunder roared across the plains, and lightning illuminated the sky in sharp, blinding flashes. Thomas and Aylin moved through the chaos, guiding the ranch hands, securing the animals, and reinforcing weak points in the fences. Every action had to be precise. There was no time for hesitation. At one point, a young calf became trapped near a broken fence. Thomas rushed toward it, but the mud and the wind made the ground slippery. Before he could reach the calf, Eileen stepped forward, bracing herself and moving with steady hands to lift the animal to safety. Thomas watched in awe as she managed the situation effortlessly, balancing strength and care in a way that left him breathless. Once the calf was safe, they worked together through the night. By the time the storm began to weaken, the ranch was wet and battered, but all the animals were alive and safe. Thomas felt a deep sense of relief and admiration for Aylin. Her presence, her courage, and her unwavering determination had saved not only the ranch but the lives of the animals under their care. As dawn broke, the storm clouds moved away, leaving the ranch covered in a fresh layer of wet soil and puddles reflecting the morning light. Thomas and Eileen walked among the animals, checking each one, their faces tired but satisfied. The ranch hands moved quietly, impressed by the way the two of them had guided everyone through the chaos. Thomas paused, looking at Aylin. She was soaked, her hair damp against her shoulders, but her eyes shone with calm determination. He realized, more clearly than ever, that she was not just a helper or a cook. She was his partner in every sense. Her strength, intelligence, and compassion had transformed the ranch and his life. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion.
I don't know what I would have done without you. Eileen smiled faintly. We did it together, she replied.
The land is strong and we are strong as well. We face challenges and we endure. Together.
The events of that night changed something in Thomas.
He had always been independent, relying on himself above all else, but he now understood the value of partnership. He began to see Aylin not just as someone who had entered his life unexpectedly, but as someone essential to it. She had come to the ranch to help, but she had brought something far greater: hope, strength, and the possibility of a life shared. In the weeks following the storm, Thomas began to change in small ways. He listened more, considered her advice more seriously, and even sought her opinion on decisions he would have once made alone. Eileen did not push him, but her quiet influence guided him toward a more open, cooperative way of living. Their daily routines became smoother, and the ranch thrived in ways it had not before. One evening, after a long day of repairs and tending to the animals, Thomas and Eileen sat on the porch watching the stars appear in the clear night sky. The cold air was sharp, but the fire they had built gave warmth, and the quiet of the plain seemed to settle around them like a blanket.
I have been thinking,
Thomas began slowly, unsure how to voice the thought he had carried for months. When you first came here, I did not understand why you said you wanted to be my wife. I thought it was impossible, even strange. But now I realize that life here without you would be empty. And I want you to be more than a helper. I want you to be my partner, in every way. Aylin's eyes softened, and she reached out to place her hand over his. I never expected you to say that, she replied quietly. I only knew that this life could be shared, that together we could make it better. You have always been strong, Thomas. I only wanted to walk beside you.
In that moment, the bond between them deepened. It was no longer about survival, or even partnership and work alone.
It was about trust, understanding, and the quiet love that had grown slowly through shared challenges, small joys, and the recognition of each other's strengths. The fences were repaired, the pastures beginning to recover from the summer drought, and the house now felt alive with warmth and order. Thomas noticed the difference in himself as well. He no longer felt the weight of solitude pressing on him. Life on the ranch, once a struggle borne alone, had become a shared journey, full of hope and purpose. Even the ranch hands had begun to respect Eileen in ways they had not before. Her courage during the storm, her knowledge of the land and animals, and her calm authority had earned their trust. Thomas observed quietly as she guided them, always patient but firm, and he felt a quiet pride in the partnership they had built, not just between themselves, but with everyone who worked on the ranch. As winter deepened, Thomas and Aylin found comfort in routine. They worked together, shared meals, and spent quiet evenings by the fire. Their conversations ranged from the practical plans for the ranch, care for the animals, to the personal, stories of the past, hopes for the future, and reflections on the life they were building together. One morning, while Thomas was tending to the horses, Aylin approached with a basket of fresh bread and a small jar of preserve she had made. She offered it with a quiet smile, and Thomas felt a warmth in his chest he had never felt before. He realized that the simplest gestures, shared meals, quiet understanding, and acts of care had become the foundation of their life together. "I am glad you came here," he said softly, taking a piece of bread, "not just for the ranch, but for everything. My life is better because of you." Aylin's smile widened, and she placed her hand on his arm. "And mine is better because of you," she replied. "We face challenges, yes, but we face them together. And that is what matters." In that moment, Thomas understood fully the transformation that had taken place. What had begun as a search for a cook had become a life-changing partnership. Aylin had not only brought skill and strength to the ranch, but she had also brought love, hope, and the quiet understanding that life is richer when shared. The winter that followed was not without work or challenges, but Thomas faced each day with a new sense of confidence. He had learned the value of trust, of partnership, and of opening one's heart to another. And in Aylin he had found not just a helper, but a companion, a partner, and a quiet love that had grown stronger with each passing day. As they sat together one evening watching the first snowflakes fall gently on the plains, Thomas realized that life had changed forever. The ranch, the work, and the hardships were still there, but they were no longer burdens he faced alone. With Aylin by his side, every challenge seemed surmountable, every hardship more bearable, and every day a gift to be shared. And in the quiet of that winter night, under a sky full of stars and softly falling snow, Thomas understood that he had not just found a cook, or even a helper. He had found a life partner, someone whose presence had transformed not only his ranch but his heart, and whose love had become the foundation of a new and brighter future. Spring arrived at the ranch with a gentle warmth that softened the rough edges of winter. The snow had melted from the plains, the creeks had begun to flow again, and green shoots appeared in the fields, promising life after the harsh cold. Thomas stood on the porch, watching the morning light touch the hills. The ranch, once struggling, now looked more alive than it had in years. The fences were sturdy, the livestock healthy, and the house filled with warmth, laughter, and the aroma of fresh bread baking in the kitchen. Aylin, moving gracefully through the house, noticed Thomas watching her and smiled. She had grown even more confident in her role, balancing household responsibilities with her involvement in the ranch. Thomas admired her not only for her skill but for the quiet strength she brought to every task. Life on the ranch had become a partnership in the truest sense, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for her presence. One morning, as Thomas prepared to ride out to check the fields, Aylin approached him with a basket of fresh eggs and herbs. She handed it to him with a gentle smile. "The chickens are healthy, and the herbs are ready for cooking," she said.
"I thought you might like them for breakfast." Thomas took the basket and felt warmth in his chest. It was not just the gesture, but the thoughtfulness and care behind it that touched him.
"Thank you, Aylin. You make every day better," he said softly. She shrugged lightly, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "I only tried to help. The ranch is important, and so are the people on it." It was in these simple moments that Thomas realized the depth of his feelings.
He had come to value her presence in every part of his life.
The partnership that had begun with work and survival had blossomed into something richer. Trust, companionship, and love that had grown quietly over months of shared experiences. The decision to marry was both natural and inevitable. Thomas wanted to honor Aylin, not only for her dedication but for the joy and warmth she had brought into his life. He planned a small, quiet ceremony reflecting the life they had built together, private, meaningful, and full of sincerity. On the morning of the wedding, the ranch was bathed in sunlight. The animals grazed peacefully, and the breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the nearby fields. Thomas wore a simple suit, his heart racing with anticipation. Aylin, dressed in a modest gown she had chosen herself, stood beside him. Her eyes shone with calm confidence and quiet happiness. The ceremony was intimate. A friend from the nearby town agreed to officiate, and a few of the ranch hands who had grown to respect and admire Island were present. There was no grand display, no elaborate decorations, but the atmosphere was filled with sincerity, warmth, and the deep understanding that this union was built on more than ceremony. It was built on life, partnership, and shared struggles. As Thomas and Alan exchanged vows, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. He had never imagined that someone could enter his life and transform it so completely. She had arrived with a bold declaration, and over time she had become the heart of the ranch, the steady hand guiding its growth, and the companion who filled the emptiness he had carried for years. After the ceremony, life continued much as it had before, but everything felt different. The ranch thrived under their shared care, and the household was filled with warmth and laughter. Island's influence extended beyond domestic life. She offered advice on the animals, the crops, and even the financial management of the ranch. Thomas learned to listen, to trust her judgment, and to value her insight. Together, they became a formidable team, capable of facing any challenge. The ranch hands, too, had grown accustomed to the partnership. They followed Aylin's guidance without hesitation, recognizing the wisdom and strength she brought to every decision. Even the neighbors, who had once been skeptical of her presence, began to see the difference she had made. The ranch was no longer just Thomas's domain. It was a shared home, thriving under the combined efforts of both of them. Every day, Thomas noticed small details that reminded him of how much his life had changed. The way Aylin prepared meals, the way she tended the animals, her calm manner when facing difficult situations. All of it made him realize how fortunate he was. He began to see that love was not only about grand gestures, but about daily acts of care, understanding, and partnership. One afternoon after a long morning of work, Thomas and Aylin sat on the porch watching the cattle graze in the sunlit pastures. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the ranch seemed alive with energy. Thomas turned to Aylin, his expression soft but serious. "You have changed everything," he said. "Not just the ranch, but my life. I can't imagine doing any of this without you." Aylin smiled, her hand brushing lightly against his. "And I cannot imagine being anywhere else," she replied. "We face the hard days together, and the good days are better because they are shared." Their life together was a balance of work and quiet moments, challenges and triumphs. They learned from each other, grew together, and faced every obstacle with determination. The ranch flourished, the animals were healthy, and even the land seemed to respond to the care and attention they gave it. Children, laughter, and plans for the future became part of their vision. While they were not yet ready to start a family, they spoke of it often, imagining a life where the ranch, the animals, and the land would continue to thrive under their care. Every decision, every effort was guided by the thought of shared life and shared responsibility. Evenings were their time to reflect. After the work was done, they would sit together, talking about the day, the land, and their hopes for the future. Thomas found himself more open than ever, sharing thoughts he had never expressed to anyone before. Aylin listened, offering insight and comfort, her presence a constant source of strength. Through every season, their partnership grew. Spring brought new growth, summer long days of work, autumn harvests, and winter nights by the fire. Each season tested them in different ways, but together they met every challenge. Their love was quiet, steady, and strong, built on months of shared labor, mutual respect, and the understanding that they were stronger together than apart. Years passed, and the ranch continued to prosper. The animals thrived, the crops grew abundant, and the house remained warm and welcoming. Thomas and Aylin had created a home, a life, and a partnership that was admired by those who knew them. Their story became a quiet legend in the area, a tale of courage, love, and the transformation that comes when two people face life together. Thomas often reflected on how much his life had changed since the day Aylin arrived. He had expected a cook, someone to help with the house, and instead he had found a partner, a companion, and a love that reshaped his world. Every day he felt gratitude, not only for the ranch and its success, but for the quiet strength and wisdom that Aylin had brought into his life. Aylin, too, reflected on the journey they had taken together. She had arrived at the ranch with a bold declaration, and over time she had become essential to its survival and success. But more importantly, She had built a life with Thomas based on mutual respect, understanding, and shared dreams. She knew that what they had was rare, a partnership that was both practical and deeply meaningful. Together, they faced challenges with courage, celebrated successes with joy, and built a life full of hope and promise. The ranch was no longer just land or property. It was a symbol of their partnership, their perseverance, and the love that had grown quietly but steadily between them. And as the sun set over the plains, casting long golden shadows across the fields and hills, Thomas and Island sat side by side on the porch, watching the cattle settle for the night. The air was filled with peace, and the quiet strength of their bond was evident in every glance, every gesture, and every shared breath. The ranch had changed, the land had flourished, and their lives had been transformed. What began as a search for a cook had become the story of a lifetime, a story of partnership, courage, love, and a home built together. And as the stars appeared in the clear night sky, Thomas and Island knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, as partners, as companions, and as a family, in every sense of the word. Life on the ranch was no longer a solitary struggle. It was a shared journey, filled with hope, purpose, and the quiet joy of a love that had grown from respect, courage, and mutual trust. And in that shared life, they found a happiness that neither had expected, yet both had longed for, a life fully and beautifully redefined.